Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. Today's video is going to take a very quick cursory look at the lay of the land in the Middle East since 1945 or so. We can't go into a lot of detail just because we don't have enough time in one short flipped video here. I took an entire class in college where all we did for the entire semester was talk about the modern Middle East. So this is going to be just a very brief overview of some of the most important people and conflicts associated with that region in the last half century or so. By the end of this video, you should be able to explain why the Middle East is such a hotbed of tension and conflict, and describe the effects of some of these conflicts specifically: the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, also known as the October War, and the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Also be able to identify or define those terms and people there: Israel, the PLO, OPEC, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and the Iran hostage crisis. So, keeping that and those terms in mind, let's go ahead and get started. People have been fighting over the Middle East going back to the time of the Crusades, since it is the Holy Land for the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims. So it was a big bone of contention for a lot of peoples in the Middle East when Israel was established as a Jewish homeland and became its own nation in 1948. A lot of Jews immigrated there, Holocaust survivors from Europe, people from Arab nations who were trying to avoid persecution in their home countries. Israel was a good place for them to be, obviously, but the conflict continued because they're surrounded by Arab states. They also share territory there with the area in green you see on the map known as the West Bank, which was a homeland for an Arab people known as the Palestinians. And the Israelis didn't recognize the Palestinians' right to that area and began building settlements in the West Bank. And an organization sprung up called the PLO in 1964. That's the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which fought for the independence of that area from any kind of Israeli occupation or control. There was also fighting over the Sinai Peninsula, which is that strip of land in between Israel and Egypt where the Suez Canal is located. So for all of these reasons, religious, strategic, all of that, Arab nations and Israel were fighting almost constantly from when they were created in the 1940s into the 1970s. So now we're going to take a quick look at some of those important conflicts and their effects. One of the first major conflicts between Israel and its Arab neighbors was the Six-Day War, which lasted for, you guessed it, 6 days in June of 1967. Israel very quickly and decisively defeated Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, and an assortment of other Arab countries who gave support in fighting Israel, but they were still no match for the Israeli army. Israel took control of the Sinai Peninsula after that really short war, which of course, as I said earlier, is a very important strategic location due to the Suez Canal and its location there on the Red Sea. Skipping down there, the Egyptians would try to liberate the Sinai Peninsula by launching an attack against Israel in 1973 on Yom Kippur, a war known as either the October War or the Yom Kippur War. Israel did not win as decisively this time, even though they did manage to hold on to the Sinai Peninsula. But the Yom Kippur War would be the last major conflict between Israel and Egypt, and the Israeli-Egyptian peace process began soon after, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. The main conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, or the most notable conflict, I should say, is the Munich Massacre, which took place at the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, West Germany, when a Palestinian terrorist organization called Black September kidnapped and then murdered 11 Israeli athletes in the Olympic Village. Israel launched a series of strikes against the West Bank, known as Operation Wrath of God, in the aftermath of that attack, and used covert operations to try to track down and kill all the Palestinians who were involved in the attacks and those who supported them. The U.S.'s support of Israel in its conflicts against the Arab countries did lead to a pretty severe consequence for the Americans in the early 1970s in the form of the OPEC oil embargo. OPEC is an organization, that's an acronym for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So that's a group of countries who produce the lion's share of the world's petroleum. And a lot of those countries, as you're probably aware, are located in the Middle East. So when America threw its support behind Israel in the Yom Kippur War in 1973, OPEC responded by embargoing sales of oil to the United States. So this led to a major energy crisis in the United States in the early 1970s, where gasoline nearly quadrupled in price and was very, very difficult to get. Eventually, the embargo would be lifted, but it did lead to permanent increases in the price of gasoline and oil in the United States. For a time, it led to a national 55-mile-an-hour speed limit to try to conserve gasoline usage as well. So even though these conflicts happened halfway around the world, it does impact the United States. The United States was also involved in brokering a peace between Israel and Egypt known as the Camp David Accords, which was signed in 1978 between the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who's seen on the right in that picture there at the bottom, and the Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat. In the middle there is President Jimmy Carter, who helped to negotiate the peace. All three of these men would eventually win the Nobel Peace Prize, in large part due to their role in brokering this peace. Anwar Sadat was assassinated 3 years later by people in his own military who were outraged by the fact that Egypt had brokered peace with Israel. This is sadly not the only incident of something like this occurring. In 1995, the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated because of outrage over his making some peace with the Palestinian Liberation Organization in the early 1990s. So even though there are attempts to, come to some kind of agreement and stop the fighting in the Middle East, there are still a lot of people who are going to be very upset since emotions run high in these conflicts. The last conflict we're going to look at in this video is the Iranian Revolution. First, a little background on Iran. In 1953, the United States and Great Britain staged a coup that overthrew the president of Iran and replaced him with Reza Pahlavi, who was known as the Shah. And he was very friendly with the United States and was willing to give the United States oil or sell oil to them at a much lower price. But he was hated by a lot of people in Iran because he was essentially a dictator and was very brutal to his own people. Still, the United States was reluctant to go against him because he was Western friendly. He didn't have communist tendencies like a lot of Middle Eastern leaders did at the time. Remember, we're also at the height of the Cold War when all of this is going on. But all this simmering, hatred of the Shah came to a head in 1978 when a lot of very conservative Muslims upset about the westernization of Iran. How, things were becoming more and more modern. Women were allowed to receive an education and work outside the home, which upset a lot of very conservative Muslims in the country. So they overthrow the Shah and install an Ayatollah named Ruhollah Khomeini, who became Iran's supreme leader and essentially turned Iran into Muslim theocracy. The United States found itself in the midst of an international crisis in 1979 when they allowed the Shah, who was dying of cancer at this point, after being kicked out of power in Iran, to come into the U.S. for cancer treatments. And this angered a lot of people in Iran who wanted to see the Shah put on trial in Iran for the atrocities he had committed against them over his 20-some-odd years in power. So protests really begin to ramp up. This is spurred on by Ayatollah Khomeini, who begins to refer to America as the Great Satan, and gets people sort of galvanized in their opposition and hatred to the Americans. And it came to a head finally in November of 1979 when a group of students stormed the American embassy in the Iranian capital of Tehran, basically, broke in and took 52 American diplomats and other citizens who worked there hostage, and they were kept hostage for over a year until January of 1981. Domestically, for the United States, the big effect the Iran hostage crisis had was that it led to Jimmy Carter's defeat in the 1980 presidential election by Ronald Reagan, because Carter was seen as being essentially unable to free the hostages. Every day they were in captivity, Carter looked weaker and weaker. And ever since this has occurred, relations between the U.S. and most Arab nations have been pretty strained. This is not helped by the fact that the United States intervened in Iraq's attempted invasion of Kuwait in the 1990s, which they went in and repelled in the first Gulf War, which angered a lot of people, and culminated in some terrorist attacks, such as the 2 World Trade Center bombings and the bombings of American embassies overseas. So, a lot of it stems from the anger surrounding things like this. So that will do it for today. If you're one of my students, we're going to spend more time looking at Middle Eastern conflicts. This is just intended to give you a pretty brief overview. As always, feel free to ask if you have any questions. Cheers.